Good afternoon. We're here at Vanderbilt University Libraries talking to Jorge Salles Diaz, who was a Buchanan Fellow in the Buchanan Fellows Program in the library in spring of 2018. Today we're going to talk about book love. And Laura Miller writes that the first book we fall in love with shapes us every bit as much as the first person we fall in love with. This emotional attachment may affect choices we make as an adult, and if you think about some of these questions, I hope you'll share your book loves with us. What was the first book you fell in love with, Jorge?
You know, I've been thinking about that. I can't quite remember. It's between The Hobbit and this children's version of Don Quixote. I think it must have been a children's version of Don Quixote because I don't think I would have been able to understand The Hobbit when I was like 6 or 7.
What made that book special to you?
I think it has something to do with travel. I think it was the first book that inspired my passion for going to different places. It's interesting because it's La Mancha is an imaginary place, but it just sparked this idea in my head that you could go somewhere at another time with different places, and that just like stuck with me. I think it's part of why I majored in history, is that those images sort of crystallize in your head, and it's a fascinating thing to go back and create that world in your head.
Have you reread the book, and if you have, how do you think about it and feel about it now?
So I read the official version of Don Quixote a couple of years ago, and it was a challenge because it was very long, and also it's written in an older Spanish, and my Spanish was a bit rusty at the time, so that helped. It was interesting because Wittgenstein has this quote that every time we recall a memory, we actually recreate it. So every time we go back to that memory, we're also creating this feeling of being there. So every time you do it, it's different. It's never quite the same thing. So I had a combination of emotions going on when I reread it. I mean, part of it was frustration because I barely understood it. Another part was like, wow, this is just like being a child again. It's that crystallization of an image in your head, and something quite fascinating because it never happens in real life.
What book has captured your imagination as a reader recently, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I was reading this biography, and I'd never had this happen to me, where a non-fiction book captivated me like this. But it was a biography written by actually a novelist. So. And he inserts this sort of ambiguity where, for instance, there's this passage where you're not quite sure if what's going on is what he is imagining in his head that is going on, and it sort of prompts this subjectivity to the whole scene that just fascinated me. I was just like, I even created my own account of what happened based on this ambiguity that he creates, and that was fascinating. I'd never experienced that with a nonfiction book.
Is there a book that set you on your professional path towards history besides Don Quixote? What impressed you about that book, if there is?
So this is interesting because so I read this book, The Great Exception, by one of our professors and my mentor, Jefferson Cowie. It's a book about the New Deal, but I was taking a class at the time with him, and it really was a process of I'd always thought of history I'd never thought of history as an argument before. And going back to this notion of subjectivity, I'd never thought about how authors place particular events in their narrative and leave others behind. It's something that, even though I was doing history, this was very early on, when my interest in history was more about traveling to all of these different places in my head and much less about the technicalities of the profession. That book really made me think about how it's very difficult to not leave behind certain narratives when you're telling a story.
And is there a book that influences you in your work and your studies?
A book that influences me in my work and my studies. I love existentialist novels. I love Sartre. I love Camus. I love Camus, even though he wouldn't consider himself an existentialist. I think this book, The Plague, really changed what I wanted to do with my life. Because so The Plague is about this terrible disaster that is happening to this town that is being decimated, and so different characters have different responses. Well, some of them say there must be a reason why this is happening, and then the protagonist says that that's not the case. That the world is absurd, and there's no reason for evil. But also like that instead of launching into nihilism, it can also create a huge responsibility, because ultimately one is responsible for what one does in life and the cruelty that exists in the world, and to change that. This book sort of created a moral imperative in me that didn't exist before that. It created a sense of responsibility. It's I highly recommend Camus in general, The Stranger, The Fall, all of them. I love them.
Is there a book you like to share with your friends and family?
Book that I like to share with my friends and family. That's a good one, because there are so many. God, I should have thought about this last one. I would say the novels by Monique Wittig. I had not read feminist novels before, and she does a particularly compelling job at really describing structures that we don't necessarily see because we live in them. And so her work has been fascinating. I mean, her philosophy personally is too hard to understand for me, but I understand the novels, and I highly recommend them, especially because of the time and place where we are at right now.
And can you tell me about a gift book that you remember?
That I was given, or that I gave?
That you were given.
That I was given. There are a couple that have really changed me. One of them is this book, Capital Moves. That's nonfiction. But my grandpa actually gave me my first copy of The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. And it's just, I had never read magical realism before. Well, actually, I take that back. It was my uncle. My uncle gave me this book, Mr. President by Miguel Ángel Asturias, one of the earliest magic realism writers. It was that one that just created this fascination in me with magical realism. It's something that I've tried to incorporate even in my nonfiction. And sometimes my professors love it, other times they hate it. But I'm fascinated with it. It's really cool. It goes back to this idea of subjectivity and reality that I think is a tension that goes throughout all of literature. It's it's a very human thing to do, to look at things through our own eyes. I don't think we can look at them any other way.
Thank you.